Welcome to Board Certified, expert interviews on medical licensing exams and healthcare careers. I'm Cassandra with Achievable, and Achievable offers adaptive online prep for exams like USMLE Step 1, MCAT, PTCE, MPTE, and CSCS, all built to give you a complete study system in one place. Each course combines clear explanations, targeted practice questions that adapt to you, and full-length practice exams designed to reflect the real test. You can try any Achievable course free at achievable.me and use the code podcast to save 10%. Now let's get started. Today we have Becca Güler with us, and Becca, I'd love if you could introduce yourself.
Great, thanks. I'm Dr. Becca Güler. Students usually call me Dr. G because my last name is short but weird, and that is just fine with me. Becca also just works. And I have been a learning specialist for a long time in education. The last several years, I've specifically worked with medical students the most, sometimes veterinary and optometry students, etc. And I'm really passionate about helping people figure out how to make their brain work for them, whether it's in the context of a test or getting tasks done that they need to do every day or just succeeding in a course. So I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks for being here. I love that because I feel like sometimes our brains can go against us. So what a
Yes.
great, what a great strategy. Cool. So today we are talking about the in-section strategies to use that make a key difference in your MCAT score. And I think this is a really interesting topic because I think it's often overlooked. People focus a lot on content and not so much as what is happening on test day. So to start things off, why do you think that is? Why do you think students focus more on content than on maybe some of the strategies and behaviors that they can incorporate to improve their score?
A good question. I think that one of the key reasons is that we're hunter gatherers as far as our neurophysiology. It's how we're still wired. We were not designed to be taking things like standardized tests, doing things in under timing, or even the concept of a multiple choice question is not in line with human thinking, like the way we're wired. Education teaches us how to maybe address some of these things, like get used to that format, but it's not really something that's natural. And most of the time, because exams are usually very content specific, you're taking a certification exam for X, whatever you need licensure for, or whatever program you need to get into. And the most clear, obvious thing to do is study that content. So I think that's one reason people head that direction is that it's laid out in front of you and you think, oh, I've just got to learn all this. It is very hard to become and to stay aware of how we're thinking, how we're choosing to address the issues in front of us when we're in the middle of a test. That is part of what we call metacognition. It's like cognition means processing things in your mind in order to do some kind of task or meet some kind of goal. Metacognition means almost like we're standing above ourselves, looking down and analyzing our thinking, analyzing our cognition. Like, how am I even going about this? Is this effective? We have to, with metacognition, we have to look at the literal things we're doing, the way we're approaching something, but we also have to be monitoring ourselves, like physically. Am I really tired? Do I need to take a break? Do I need to just close my eyes for a few seconds? Things like monitoring our pace get really hard to do. So it's a really challenging thing. And I think also that when it comes to people that tend to help us with prepping for tests, usually they are themselves content experts, or at least like teachers or tutors in that content. It's what they know. And so that's what tends to get addressed the most because it's the most obvious and it's what most people have the most information about. That's why I really like my job because I'm an expert in the non content side. I'm the expert in how we're thinking, how we process things. I don't have to know someone's content to be able to help them figure out how to better address the exam as long as I can see and understand the nature of the content and what kind of tasks they have to do. Do they need to calculate something? Do they have to differentiate between things? Do they need to become better at identifying things in images? Or is it that they're going to be reading a lot of scenarios and word problems? So it's the side that much less people have information about, the thinking side. So that's my theory on that one.
Yeah, such a good point. And I think, like, we're going to get into some of those strategies and behaviors about what does separate a student who knows the material, who has been studying, they've had a tutor, like they know their stuff, and then one who actually does perform well on test day. Because I think a lot of people assume that I know this, I know my stuff, I know this content, I'm going to ace this thing, I'm going to get this high score that I'm striving for. And that's not always the case because on exam day, conditions are very different. There's a lot going through your mind, like you mentioned. So, can you kind of walk through some of those strategies and things that students can do during the test itself?
Yes, absolutely. I think the 5 key areas I think about as far as these in section behaviors while we're in the middle of a section on the test are pacing, tracking, marking or flagging items, skipping, is in intentionally skipping, and moving on. So I'm going to handle those one at a time. I'll start with pacing. And so pacing it really starts with us looking at how many items are there. And some tests have an exact number of items, some have more of an estimate. We might also, like on the MCAT, have to figure in a few of these items are going to be individual, the majority are going to be based in a passage. So we have to pace ourselves according to, I have to read that passage and then handle the questions that go with it. And the number of questions can vary a bit between 5 and 7 on different passages. So those are all factors we have to think about when it comes to pacing. But something that people often don't realize is that humans are not great at thinking ahead. And we tend to, when it comes to pacing or like making a schedule, we tend to start at the beginning and try to move forward. And we're not really great at estimating time and going forward that way. We do a lot better with starting with something definite and working backwards. And so when it comes to pacing, I highly recommend that for the exam that you look at the total time allowed for that section. And then you look at the approximate or exact number of items and you divide it up and you factor in, is there going to be a passage in there? For the MCAT, I would definitely say you can't really do it per item. It's going to be per passage. And work from the end. What's the total amount of time we have? And about how much time should I be spending per passage if I divide this up evenly? And then you make checkpoints for yourself, like mile markers, working backwards. Okay, so I should be at passage 6 at this point. And I would put that time, I would deduct it from the clock because the MCAT and a lot of exams will actually have a countdown clock. And so it's going to make sense for you to have your little guideposts or mile markers or checkpoints, have them laid out the same way that your clock is going to be on the screen as you're practicing. So if you determine that you need about, let's say, like 15 minutes for 2 passages, just as an example, then we would take the total amount of time, deduct 15, and then say, okay, I should be at this point at this at this place time wise. And I recommend putting that into a list, post it somewhere, like by your computer where you tend to study, memorize it. And it's something that you would use whenever you do a practice test, or if you're doing practice sets that mimic the real test, then use that same timing so that you have those checkpoints where you check in on your time. And the objective is that we want to, as we're working forwards, then in the test, like having those points, we stop, we check the time, and we see, do I have more time than I need? And that means I'm going a little too fast. I probably need to slow down. Or do I have a little less time than I should have on the clock, which means I'm moving a little slowly and I do need to go a little quicker. And I'm going to talk more about that in a while with the moving on theory. Going faster doesn't mean trying to read faster, for example. It usually means letting go faster.
Yeah, and I'm curious with that, is there, I don't know, is there like, I imagine there's some anxiety that might come up checking the clock and constantly, like, you're trying to focus on the test, you're looking at the clock, you're trying to calculate where you should be at that moment. So, how can students kind of handle that? And maybe that's part of the moving on that you're talking about. But how can they maybe not let the clock, like, kind of run the show, even though, yes, it does a little bit, but how to still be focused on the test?
Yeah, it's a good point. This is where the practice comes in. We tend to be a lot more secure about something or feel less nervous about something when it is a situation that we've practiced in the same format. And so having those checkpoints where we always stop, let's say, 2 passages in. When we do a practice test, when we're on the real test, it's exactly the same. When I finish 2 passages, I check the clock. Okay. We're not checking the clock constantly, and we're not checking it at odd intervals. We check it at designated intervals. And that can help our nervous system to relax a bit because it knows we're going to check it. It knows what's coming. So that helps us to relax a bit and it makes it more predictable. And over time, when you institute that or implement that, sorry, when you implement that in your practice test and you're able to see that you had the chance to intervene and affect the outcome from early on in the passage, and you see how that was helpful, then that's further like positive feedback for the brain to know that, okay, checking the clock at designated intervals has a positive effect. And so it actually is a control mechanism for me. It helps me to have more control in the situation. So that's what I recommend. Otherwise, we end up checking the clock at random intervals. And often people will get so involved in the exam itself that they don't check the clock until there are like 7 minutes left in 2 passages. And that's impossible to do well with the kind of passages we're looking at. And then it's really panic. And those last 2 passages we now have to rush through may have been the best ones. They may have been like the easiest ones in the set. It really gives you more control to practice that pacing.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And, as you mentioned, practice, like that's a huge part of it. Practice with a clock so that you are kind of knowing when to be looking during those designated times so that you kind of have it's almost like a muscle memory situation where you're like, okay, 2 passages, let's check where am I at with things.
Yes.
Cool. So then the next one you mentioned was tracking, I believe. Can you kind of walk us through what that entails?
Yes. One more note about pacing while I'm thinking about it. That's pacing also gives you a great opportunity to integrate something like a deep breathing strategy. So if you have those designated points that you're going to be stopping at 2 passages, you can stop when you're done with 2 passages, do a couple of rounds of box breathing, for example, get your breathing in, recenter, and then check the time. And that can be part of that built-in mechanism. Yes, tracking. So tracking has to do with that, having those intervals, checking where we are, and deciding, am I on pace? Am I moving too fast? Am I moving too slow? So it's making those decisions. It's keeping an eye on things like how many have I marked so far? So it's a monitoring task when we're tracking. And that leads us really to the marking and marking or flagging. It might be called different things in different exams. I'm in the habit of using both interchangeably for MCAT, either way, mark or flag. This is something that I see typically being greatly overused. And the idea with marking or flagging is that we want to have a minimal amount marked. And that's so that when we get to the end of a section, if you have, say, 4 minutes left, we don't want to have 4 minutes and 8 items marked because which ones are you going to go back to? You can't go back to all 8 of them. And are these 8 items you marked all equal in terms of like value or like what you could do with them? No. You're going to have a few where you could actually go back and finish working out a calculation. Like you just were running out of time and you moved on because of the time, not because you had no idea. But other items probably were marked because we just weren't sure of it. And if we return to those, we're really just going to stare at it and ruminate some more and probably not actually get anywhere. So those are not as valuable to return to. This idea of marking or flagging is really to be ideally, the ideal is to really be selective, be discriminatory about what we're going to actually mark. I suggest about 10% or less. So if you have 53 items in a section, then we should have 5 or 6 items marked out of the whole 53 items, for example. And in terms of neuroscience, what this connects to is that humans weren't designed to deal with a large range of choices. It's a very cognitively demanding task, for example, to be in a large supermarket. If we need to pick up some coffee, and there are 37 varieties of coffee, that is unless you have one certain brand you always buy. Let's say your brand is out. Well, now you've got 36 other options you have to like scan through and try to choose from. And that's overwhelming. It's exhausting. I think we've all had some grocery store moment like that before, a supermarket moment.
Yes.
So I think that's something to relate to. Like, we do not want that kind of supermarket choice moment in the middle of the MCAT or any tests, right? Sometimes just going to a smaller store that has 10 options, okay, there's less for me to choose from. I can make this choice faster because there are less things for me to consider. And that's the idea, is when we get to the end of a section, we don't want a whole lot of options to consider. We want to have marked very intentionally. And what I recommend flagging or marking is the sort of item where maybe it's a physics question, something that involves some sort of calculation, or we have to draw out a diagram, like a biochemical pathway to draw out the steps and get to the step that we need. But those are the kind of questions that might take a lot of time. And if we realize I've been on this one item already 2.5, 3 minutes, and I don't want to lose out on several other questions for the sake of finishing this one, that is the perfect situation where we would want to flag it. Go ahead and put a guess answer just so it's not blank, just in case we don't get back. But it's the perfect thing to come back to. A great question to ask yourself to determine if you should mark something or not is, what would I do if I came back to this question? And if the answer is, oh, I would just keep working out this calculation, or I would draw out that biochemical pathway I was thinking about, or this diagram, and I think I have the right information, I should be able to get to it. I just need more time. That's a reason to mark. If the answer to that, what would I do when I come back, is more, I'm going to think about it some more and I'm going to ruminate on it some more, and I'm probably just going to spin, get in a whirlpool, then don't mark it. Just let it go.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. And there is so much thought process that goes into this while you are in the exam. And so it can be kind of tough to make that decision in the moment of like, am I going to come back? Am I going to, just mark an answer and move on? And so I think that's such good advice to just ask yourself, like, what would future me do? What would I actually do with this question when I come back? I think that's really helpful, and it can kind of help you make your decision much quicker and then kind of carry on to the next question. So then with that, talking about skipping. So you mentioned intentionally skipping a question. So can you kind of talk about that and what you mean by that?
Yes. Whenever we're taking a test, this theory underpins both the skipping and the moving on mentality. I find that where we often get hung up is we have this idea that our ability to know and answer every question is what determines like our worth as a future doctor or potential med student or whatever we're doing. And yet, if we think about how these tests are graded, the MCAT does not have any kind of penalty for a wrong answer. And then it also does not have any kind of points awarded for you attempting an item. Okay. If you attempt something and get it wrong, or you guess and get it wrong, it doesn't matter. It's the effect is going to be the same. And so on a personal level, people will often stay and insist on working on an item. And the only reason can be because they're associating it with something about their personal worth. Why don't I know this? I have to know this. What kind of student am I going to be, or doctor am I? I'm not a quitter. But again, in this instance, in this exam, you're not going to get points for trying it, for actually attempting it and spending time on it. And our goal with this test is to get as many points as possible. So I'm letting that sink in, right? So we need to use whatever strategy in the end gets us the most points possible. So if we come to a question that we realize, or in this case, or might be a passage even, but if we come to a question and we realize, oh, to answer this question, I would have to know, have in my memory, have memorized the shape of this amino acid. I have to know the shape of lysine. And I didn't get to the amino acids, memorizing the shape. If you know that you don't have that fact, would you have that fact later? Are you going to have that fact 20 minutes from now? But where would it come from? We can't look it up. We can't go learn it, right? In the same section. It's not going to fall out of the sky. And accepting like this requires a fact that I would have to have memorized and I just don't have it. Okay. And in the case of something like the car section, advice that I frequently give is regarding the car section. I'm someone who studies metacognition, but specifically in reading was what I did my dissertation work on. So this is I ate, slept, and breathed this all throughout my doctorate. In the car section in the MCAT, the time that's provided for the amount of reading that you have to do is honestly a bit ridiculous. It's one of the toughest time constraints I've seen with the amount of text you're supposed to be able to read and then critically analyze and be able to answer those questions.
Mhm.
Almost no one gets through all the passage with equal efforts. That's very unusual. And I can't. And I'm a good, strong reader. It's something I study. I can't do it with equal effort. And I recommend that when people come to each passage, that they do a preview to give themselves like a trailer, like a movie trailer. And that would be like maybe read the first paragraph, um, read the first sentence or so of each paragraph as you go through, just a skim. This is like 30 seconds to a minute. And this is not wasted time because it is going to give you the gist of what it's about. And that is going to inform your process with reading it in detail later, if it is one that we read. And we want to determine three things whenever we're looking at a CARS passage or something else. We want to look at what is the subject matter, how familiar am I with this, and then what's the vocabulary like? Is there a lot of like unfamiliarity in there? Are there a lot of really long words, a lot of Latin words, or are they fairly straightforward? And we want to look at things like the format as well. In cars, for example, I look for a lot of semicolons and a lot of commas. That tells me there are a lot of complex sentences I'm going to have to break down to get the separate ideas out of. And in something like one of the science sections, I might be looking for a lot of diagrams. If they put a lot of graphs in or a lot of diagrams and they look very complicated, these are things that help me to know this is going to take a long time, especially if it's an area I'm not as familiar in and I have limited time on this test. Then I recommend identifying one, particularly in cars, identifying one. If you think of like a scale of 1 to 5, how easy or difficult is this for me individually? And it's going to vary by person based on our background. When I hit a passage that I say, this is a 5 for me, it's the kind of passage I always hope I won't get. And here we are, it's here. Then I make the choice to not even read that one. I previewed it, I made the determination it was a 5, and I pull my standard guess answer out of my pocket. For me, that's C. I just like the letter C. It's not statistically significant. No letter really is. I just put CC all the way down and I move on. I skip reading that passage and trying to intently answer the questions. And that gives me several minutes to now invest in all the other passages that are a better fit, that I am statistically more likely to get correct answers out of anyway. And now instead of getting 3 out of 5 or 4 out of 5 correct, I can get 4 or 5 out of 5 correct. I can go up, like get one more correct out of a few passages. I've done math several times, and the passage that people would choose to skip when I've asked them to identify one, when they've stayed around and spent 10 or 12 minutes on that passage working on it, the number of correct answers is usually just about the same as if they had just put one letter guess answer all the way down. It works out the same most of the time. And so we generally will come out ahead by redeeming that time, investing that time in other passages that we need to work harder on. And part of me might say, "Oh, I feel like a weenie skipping this passage. I feel like I should be able to do all of these." I'm not worried about that. I'm worried about getting points on this test. That's
Yep.
the mentality, right? With what gets us in the end, what gets me the most correct answers in that section, which converts to points in that section. And that is something that I typically will see. I'd say for students whose scores are stuck in the like high 400, like 495 in that area, or 501, 502, typically I see there are some content areas they need to work on, but there is always test behavior as well. Needing to skip, and they haven't been willing to do it or weren't aware of it, not pacing themselves and then running out of time later, that kind of thing. But then for students who are making pretty high scores, let's say they're already at a 518, but their goal is a 522, these strategies can be the difference. Like they've mastered most of the content. If you're already scoring in the near 520, you've mastered the majority of the content. There's no way you would be getting that high of a score. And so that's where these strategies, they can help get you out of that swamp you're stuck in and we want to break the 500s and start getting into those scores that we need, or you're getting a pretty decent score and we just want to push it and get it higher. Either way, these are often the things that are going to help you break into that next score level.
Yeah, exactly. And I wanted to dig a little deeper into what you mentioned, and you mentioned it a couple times, which is being almost kind of stubborn when it comes to wanting to skip a question or not wanting to skip a question, rather. So, how can you kind of like get over that? And, you talked about maybe tying some of your personal worth to that situation. Maybe, that can also influence the rest of the exam as you move forward. So, are there any tips or maybe strategies that you can do in that moment when you catch yourself, maybe being a little stubborn and you're like, okay, I need to reset my mental state right now?
Yes, it's tough. It really is a psychological battle. And the first thing we have to do is be aware of it and admit that's an issue for us and see that. And it's about I think a bit of a shift in mind frame. Like we have to embrace the concept that, and maybe even tell ourselves this is part of self talk. You may need to say it out loud and say, it's about correct answers, not attempts. It's about points, not trying. You know, it's about point. I'm not a quitter. I'm skipping strategically. We have to literally say these things out loud to help yourself get more into that frame of mind. It's something that I found really helpful personally, and several students I've worked with over the years have mentioned like the idea and they adopted it. And that's to say, a lot of people are taking this test. I don't need to get every question, every passage, every question. I had to get every item right. I have to get most right. And I like to think that the questions on this test are sent for different people, right? Like the universe sends different questions for different people. We all have these
Yeah.
different backgrounds, etc. And if I get to a question that is it's just beyond the amount of material that I got to, or I would just have to do it way faster than I'm able to do it at the time I'm given. Even if I know how to do it, I'm just not fast at that. And that's something I can identify with personally. I'm not fast at math. I'm okay at math, but it's not something I pick up really quickly, and I've never done calculations very quickly even when I practice. And so for me that's always been a strategy, like taking the GRE a couple of times for masters and later doctoral level work. When I'm in the middle of the quantitative section and they throw some like pre-calc at me, that was the point where I'm like, look, I have relearned algebra for the third time. I reviewed geometry, I covered the trig. That took lots and lots of time for me to relearn and shape up, and I drew the line at trying to learn the calc, pre-calc and calc, because it's not something I even took in college. So when I come to a question like that, I go, "Oh, the universe sent this question for someone else."
Yes.
And
I
just
love
think
that.
like somebody out there is gonna benefit from this one. That's fabulous. I'm gonna send it on to them and move on. Now, when we're just doing practice questions and we're learning, we're working on content, great. If you've got the time to learn it, learn it. Try to master the content, absolutely. But no matter how much preparation we do, there will almost always be a couple of questions in each section that just pop up and we just don't happen to know them. And that's okay. Just assume that the universe sent them for someone else and move on. It can help us just accept that. But the idea of it's correct answers. I'm going for points. The I don't get points for attempts. And it means nothing for me to know it or not know it. That doesn't say anything about me or what kind of doctor I'm going to be or what kind of medicine I'm going to be. This is just one item out of a big bucket of items. But yeah, self-talk is yeah, big thing.
Absolutely, especially in the middle of such a stressful situation. And it, really comes down to self-awareness, knowing kind of your strengths, knowing your weaknesses, and then acceptance of those exact things, especially the weaknesses. And I think being able to kind of have that confidently in your pocket as you go into test day is going to be really huge. And it's going to help you kind of move forward question by question and maybe not be as stressed because, like you said, oh, you know what? This question isn't for me. I'm going to get the ones that are, and I know I'm going to get those ones. So I think that's a really, really cool way to look at that and helpful, like very helpful. Cool. So then I guess we kind of were talking about a little bit, but moving on. And again, I think that is kind of the same as we've been talking about. It's really the mental reset of it and being able to like do your little breathing exercises and then move on, making that, executive decision to be like, all right, this one isn't for me. That's not a problem. I'm going to continue forward. Is there anything else that you wanted to add to kind of moving on?
Yeah, I will say this that there's a lot of research regarding self-efficacy, which is something that people may be familiar with, but the basic idea is that I realize that I have some way to actually affect the outcome of something that I'm doing. And I think that when it comes to these kinds of tests, these standardized tests and they're timed, we th- people taking the test, we often feel like the test is just happening to us. Like, it's just a situation I'm in. I have no control. I feel like questions are just being thrown at me, and I'm just scrambling to try to keep up. And we feel like there's really nothing we can do to affect the outcome. I just walk in with whatever knowledge I have, and that's it. That's my score. And we don't think of there being something in the moment that we can do. And honestly, a standardized test, because as I mentioned, it's not in line with our neurophysiology, it's not the way we naturally think. A standardized test is a really big test of our self-regulation abilities, of being able to keep an eye on our physical state, on our emotions, to keep diverting our thinking back to something that's helpful and productive, right? It's not helpful and productive for us to get stuck in an idea of, I wasn't sure about those last three questions, so that's it for the rest of the test. Like, I think it's over. It's not going to be very helpful. This self efficacy, being able to determine what can I do that would affect the outcome? That's very important. And something like moving on, when we decide this is an item that, whether it's that we decide that we're going to skip that passage or skip that question and just put that guess answer and move on, or if it's a matter of I am attempting this item because I think I know enough to figure it out, but we also then keep an eye on the time and see how long we've invested in that question already. And we make that decision to, yeah, there's nothing else I can constructively do for this. I'm just going to let it go now and move on. Or I'm marking it because if I have time at the end, there is something tangible I could do. I could keep working on this. But that moving on, we're doing something in the moment that affects the outcome. And that's powerful when we start to embrace that and we start doing that with, say, our practice tests, and that becomes the way that we operate and we practice it that way, whether it's practice sets or full length practice exams, it becomes more of a mentality. It goes from a strategy to an actual frame of mind that we can carry with us, because it's like a habitual frame of mind. Then we can carry that with us into the exam. Or in an exam, anytime we're nervous, our hunter gatherer brains cannot tell the difference between I'm nervous about this test or like I'm being chased by a saber-tooth tiger.
Yeah.
Our brain interprets all negative feelings as some kind of risk because historically they were. And in moments where we're nervous or we feel at risk, we will not implement some new strategy. We're not in that frame of mind to be able to do it. We will revert to what our habits are. And so that's why implementing these things in our practice and making it become a habit, it gives you that moment where you're nervous and then, oh, let me just lean on my habit that I've developed. And so if that's a habit that's something that's productive and helpful, you'll be able to lean on that on the test day. But yeah, I love just emphasizing that moving on gives you control in the situation.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that a lot. And it's almost like the habits can even be almost subconscious too. Like if you're
Yes.
not aware and you're not, using the practice exams and timing those exams, and utilizing all of these strategies, then you can on test day maybe revert to some habits that aren't going to serve you as well and are going to
Yep.
kind of make you panic, and you're going to, have poor performance because of it.
Yes.
So obviously, practice, practice, practice using these strategies, not only to kind of test your knowledge of the material, but like you said, test, your emotional state, your physical state while you are in this very structured, rigid, experience. Is there anything else that you would recommend that students can do to develop some of these helpful habits that are going to help them during the test?
Yeah, I think one thing I would say is that yes, practice, but also analyze. So after we do practice blocks of questions, practice passages, after you practice tests, and don't just analyze. Students will often talk about, oh, I'm reviewing my incorrects or reviewing my missed items. And that's great. But what they're focused on is content review. But the very first thing we need to do, and we actually have a podcast episode that we've done on this on how to review a practice test after. So I definitely recommend heading over there. But that analysis of, okay, why did I miss this question? Did I miss it because of content? Because like I didn't know a fact I needed to know? Or was it actually that I knew the content or I knew enough of the content to fill in the pieces and probably get it right? And where I went wrong is that my pacing wasn't right and then I didn't have enough time to do it. Or I marked too many items and then didn't get back to it. Or I should have just skipped this one. Skipping this one, I only got 1 out of 7 correct on this passage anyway. I could have skipped it and gotten the same score. And use that time for other places. Analyzing what did we do? How did it work? So when it comes to these kind of strategies, what should I have done instead? And so then what's that going to turn into an action item when I practice next? When I come to this similar situation, what I'm going to do is X and then implement that in the practice. So to analyze and then keep implementing from that analysis, implementing that into our next round of practice, that is how we're going to build these strategies and they're going to become habitual. These are the big things.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. This was such an important conversation.
Thanks for having me on.
This has been Board Certified, hosted by Cassandra from Achievable with Becca Güler. And Achievable has great online courses for the USMLE Step 1, MCAT, PTCE, MPTE, and the CSCS. You can try them out for free at achievable.me.